a talk lecture from Professor Sarah Lawson. It's one of my favourite topics. It's about cuisine, and Sarah has willingly written a book on West Indian cuisine. Please welcome Sarah Lawson.
Thank you, Ros, and to everybody for attending today. Ros kindly referred to me as having written a book on cookery earlier on. I didn't write a book on cookery, I'm afraid. I wrote a book about Caribbean food, writing and culture. But what I'm going to do this afternoon, hopefully not too long, is to give you a short history of the cooking pot as a way of introducing the links between Caribbean food and Caribbean storytelling. And when I'm talking about cooking pots, I'm not just talking about any cooking pots, but a particular cooking pot. Get it to work. Anybody tell me what this is called? It's a duchy. It's actually there in the picture, isn't it? So I'm talking about Dutch pots, or a duchy. So if you were around in the 1980s and can remember musical use past the duchy, that's what they were referring to, the duchy pot. And if the pot could talk, it would be able to tell you of its transatlantic history and its travels from Europe to Africa, to the Caribbean and to to North America, and the many meals and stories it's engendered. However, I'm going to suggest in this talk that the Caribbean Dutch pot, I know it's confusing, named after the Dutch that introduced it for use on their slave ships, taking slaves from Africa to the Caribbean and North America, lies at the heart of a rich culinary and literary experimentation. Improvisation is something that the Caribbean does very well. There's actually a term, creolization, which refers to the ways in which people take parts of different cultures and make something new. And that making something new includes not just meals, but storytelling. Meals which involve storytelling, and storytelling which involves meals. So, my background, just a little bit about me. I'm not going to talk about me, I'm not the most interesting person here. But as Ros suggested, I published a book a few years back called Food, Text and Culture in the Anglophone Caribbean. And Anglophone Caribbean means the English-speaking Caribbean. And it's a rather clunky title. It wasn't my choice of the title, it was the choice of my publishers. But really what the book tries to do is to suggest the ways in which food lies at the heart of almost all Caribbean cultural forms. Not just written text, but calypso, music, performance, and so on and so on. It's written into the daily lives of many millions of peoples. What have I got to do with the Caribbean? Well, on the surface, not very much at all. I grew up in a tiny little white Oxfordshire town. My best friend had parents that came from Jamaica and from Trinidad. And the father would tell stories, would tell Anansi stories, and I'll come on to who Anansi is in just a moment. And I thought to myself as a kind of 6-7-year-old child, there's a world of something in this, and I don't know what it is, but I'm going to find out. And that sparked an interest in the Caribbean. So I went on and studied this at university and did a PhD, and I've been teaching and writing on Caribbean culture for nearly 40 years now. So I really am that old. So as part of this book, I went to Barbados in 2018, and I was very, very privileged in that I met a lot of people that were very happy to invite me into their kitchens and to take me on island tours, to take me on island adventures. Here are some pictures of some of the people that I met. So what I did is, I was privileged to be invited into these spaces to talk about food and storytelling, to talk about food and home, to talk about food and identity, and the ways in which foodways are changing on this tiny Caribbean island as sugar production recedes, fast food outlets come in, the ways in which people eat are changing. And this is the Rasta community in the centre of Bridgetown, where I had a delicious vegan meal. Here's one of the Rastas telling me about ITAL food and different ways in which they cook. So the book does much more than this. It looks at the history of food, the ways in which African food, Indian food, European food come together in the Caribbean and become creolised in different ways. It looks also at the role of cookery books, and in particular Levi Roots, who won Dragon's Den some years back, and on the back of that investment started to produce reggae products. And I'm quite critical of Levi in some respects, not because I think that he's a bad person or a bad cook, but because he had the opportunity to widen our knowledge of Caribbean food, but instead it just became a little bit about hot sauce and jerk chicken. And if anybody that's been to anywhere in the Caribbean will know, there's much, much more to Caribbean food. So that's me, and back to the Duchy. Things that I'm going to say today. So the Dutch pot or the Duchy is kind of what brings this together. I'll do a little bit of history, go back and talk about the triangular trade, which of course is the slave trade and the importation and exportation of commodities and people as commodities. Say something about oral storytelling, talk about the first cooks of the Caribbean, those First Nation peoples called the Amerindians. Say something about Anansi, folk hero, spider-man, half spider, half man, depending on which version you look at. Something that the Africans brought with them from Africa to the Caribbean and still exists today. Give an example of a one-pot meal. Cooking within one pot is a tradition in the Caribbean for very obvious reasons, and I'll speak a little bit about that. And then I'll end very, very briefly with a Caribbean philosophy which is of making do. It's not exclusively Caribbean, but it's found in lots of Caribbean communities. You cook what you have, you cook what is seasonal, you cook what your neighbours give you. You do not go to the supermarket and buy green beans that were grown in Kenya and are available out of season, although, I found that you could also do that. So just a little bit of history here, a disturbing history in many respects as well. Some of the papers this morning have been talking about this. When we talk about the triangular trade, we're talking about the Atlantic slave trade, and we're talking about the importation of manufactured goods from Europe, which were exchanged for people as commodities. And those enslaved peoples are then exported to the West Indies and to North America to work on plantations in extractive economies to produce things such as sugar, coffee, other crops as well. And then that raw material, the sugar in this case, comes back to Europe to be sipped in those luxury drinks, certainly in the 18th century, coffee and to a lesser extent tea, all to sweeten a cup of coffee. Heavy black cast iron pots, cauldrons and skillets are the mainstay of African-derived cuisines across the globe. But what I'm interested in today is, of course, their use in the Caribbean. Storytelling in every culture starts with oral narratives. It doesn't start with written text, and that's the case in the UK just as it is in the Caribbean. But in the Caribbean there's a particularly rich strain of oral narratives. Stories were often told in outdoor spaces, they still are, in cooking spaces, in yards, and by yard I mean the home kind of environment, outside and inside. And that link between cooking and storytelling has always been an intimate and intertwined one. One of the things that I used to conceptualise this really in my book was that it's a kind of call and response between food and storytelling. Just as in a church service, the priest might offer a prayer and then the congregation responds. That's call and response. We find that in African diaspora communities across the world, including in the States. But here in the Caribbean, oral storytelling is alive and well. In certain African countries still, and in the Caribbean, the traditional opening to an oral story is not once upon a time, but crick, to which the audience say, and a crack. And the storyteller might interrupt the story and say, and a crick, just to make sure they're awake, we're actually listening. And their audience will say, and a crack. And that's an African legacy, a cultural inheritance that's come from Africa to the Caribbean. And that repeated refrain, crick, crack, reminds the listener that this is a story that we're listening to, and that stories matter. And I say that stories matter, not because I'm a literature practitioner, but because within any oral culture, only the stories that matter get retained. If a story is not useful, it will be forgotten. Stories that are useful, and sometimes in coded ways, are the stories that are kept, that are passed on. And that's a kind of call and response between food and culture. So to tell a story in this way, a crick and a crack, demands respect for the story, demands respect for the storyteller who's passing on their wisdom. Just to point point out here, the picture here is of Louise Bennett, Jamaican poet and performer, who was one of the most significant figures in the 20th century and yet was constantly seen as marginal. She was told repeatedly that her poems were not suitable to be published in anthologies of Jamaican writing. And the reason for that was that many of them were orally based, and more than that, they used what's called nation language, or those languages that are spoken by ordinary people in the Caribbean. And repeatedly, Louise Bennett was told, what you're doing is doing dialect, you're not doing poetry. Being a fierce Talawa woman, being a Jamaican woman, she fought back against this, and generations of poets owe their place in the canon, so to speak, on her ferocity, on her resistance to this idea that only written texts matter and that poetry has to be read silently. It doesn't. All poetry starts as spoken and sung. So this is Louise Bennett, who is well known within Jamaica and within the diaspora. And another writer I just want to introduce here, because he's fascinated by the link between storytelling and food, is Austin Clarke, who's born in Barbados in the 1930s. He grew up there in a very Anglophile culture, and in his later life worked and wrote in Canada. And in 1999, he published a book called Breadfruit and Pigtails, which was what he called a culinary memoir. It was a history of his life, storytelling of his life through food. And this notation always haunted me. He says very early on in the text, as a boy, I was surrounded by women. Mother, countless aunts, women cousins, all the neighbourhood women, my mother's friends, women who were all continuously involved in some confounding and miraculous feat in the kitchen. I can still see those women performing feats of culinary magic. The phrase uses that, culinary magic, with all the arrogance, intolerance to criticism and competitiveness that is peculiar to persons whose knowledge is based exclusively on an oral tradition, on myth, on the inheritance of customs. So there's Austin Clarke looking back to his childhood and the women around him that are cooking, not on their own, but collectively in a community, working together, talking together, passing on knowledge, but not in a written form, in an oral form. So for him, this is very much cooking as oral transmission, the call and response between storytelling and cooking. But if you talk to people from the Caribbean, you'll find that some of them do own cookbooks. They don't necessarily use them in the way that I think British people don't necessarily use them. You know, they look at them, they think, well, that looks great, but never get around to cooking. They might keep them in their book press. Some use cookbooks, but I met many women who said, no, that's not what I do. And I would say, well, how do you cook this? And they'd say, well, I do this and I do that. How much are you putting in? Just that and just that. And I'd say, well, how much is just that? And they'd say, are you not watching me, Sarah? So it's about embodied knowledge. It's about the body. It's often about women, not just women, passing on this knowledge. Not exclusively, but there's still some of this around. So if I take you right back to the beginning of cooking in the Caribbean, we need to acknowledge that the first people that were there, long before any Europeans or African enslaved peoples or Indians as indentured workers, were those First Nation peoples, Amerindians. They weren't one group, there were lots of different tribal groups. In fact, the Caribs give their name to the Caribbean. So the Amerindians are the Caribbean's first cooks. And the ones that the one food that we have inherited from the First Nation peoples of the Caribbean region is barbecue, and you might not be aware of that. It comes from the tradition of barbacoa, what the Spanish later called barbecue. It's a practice of marinating and roasting meats over open coals, but not just any open coals or wood, but that's also interesting, but over a raised platform. So barbecue goes right back to those first people in the Caribbean. And importantly, a number of other culinary practices do as well. So using the juice from the cassava, sweet or bitter, to make bami cakes, bread, farina, the use of cassareed, which is a preservative. If you put that in your one pot meal, it will keep it going for longer. That's a key ingredient in a dish that I'm going to talk about a little bit later called pepper pot. So, on to some of their stories. This rather blurry picture is supposed to be a tree of life. And this is a tapir here with the tapir baby, and you might have thought, where are we going now, Sarah? Well, Amerindian stories, and we don't have written versions of them, we only have adaptations because they were oral narratives. Some of them tell the story of the creation of the world. And in one particular story, the story of the tapir, this long-snouted kind of pig-like animal, we hear how they believed that when they first arrived on Earth, this is the Amerindians, from the skyland, all the vegetables and fruits that they needed grew on one tree, and that tree was known as the tree of life. And from that tree, the tapir fed. The land that they'd arrived in had very poor soil and yielded little, but they noticed that the tapir and his babies, her babies, were fat and well fed. And they followed, they sent a woodpecker to go and find out where the tapir was eating. However, the woodpecker gave himself away by the noise he made when he got to the tree, eating from the fruit. And they sent a rat who bargained with the tapir, and they agreed to share. But the rat was so greedy that the Indians found him sleeping with his mouth full of corn, and they forced him to take them to the tree. And the ending of that story of the creation is really, really pertinent. After many months of gorging on the fruit from the tree, they felled the tree, they cut it down, and each man took a piece to plant for his own. In many ways, I think that's a contemporary story, given that we're facing all kinds of environmental challenges today. The idea that they get to the food, they gorge on it, and then they cut it down. Yes, they're propagating little parts of it for others, but it carries the message that we're all responsible for our planet. And our planet is much more than a source of food for us. In fact, you could frame the Amerindians as the original kind of eco-sensitive cultivators, in a sense. And I know that's a generalisation. Jamie Oliver's in all kinds of trouble at the minute for generalising about Aboriginal Australians. But it's possible to argue that their environmental awareness was far greater than ours today. And their cooking styles and ingredients are still a culinary legacy to the Caribbean today. So the next part of the story, anybody recognise this character? It's called Anansi, sometimes spelled A-N-A-N-C-Y, sometimes Brera Nancy, sometimes Kwesi Anansi. Kwesi is that West African word for born on a Sunday. Anybody recognise Anansi? Are there any guys? No. Anansi is extremely important. Anansi is one of the many things that enslaved people brought with them from Africa to the Caribbean. I think sometimes the popular myth is that Africans brought nothing but themselves, but they brought rich cultural legacies, including storytelling, including ways of cooking. Anansi comes from West Africa, and he's a spider man, half spider. He's a trickster figure, which West African slaves, enslaved people, brought with them to the Caribbean and continued to adapt and to develop on their sugar plantations. So slaves bring very little materially with them, but what they bring with them are their foodways and their oral narratives. And Nancy is a spider god of Ashanti tradition. He actually originates in West Africa, he survived the Middle Passage, and he still exists today. And often when you encounter Anansi, for example, if you Googled Anansi, it often comes up with children's books, writing for children, and they're often picture books. So some examples here. Yay, it actually works. So here, a number of different imagined versions of Anansi, of Brother Anansi. Why should Anansi's stories survive? That Middle Passage from Africa to the Caribbean. So I've suggested that they're often seen as children's stories, they're often read as folk stories to amuse or edify young children. But I want to suggest, alongside a whole body of critical material, that they're not simply this. What they are coded survivalist narratives. They are coded messages which the slaves used to speak to each other and to educate each other on how to eat, how to survive, how to resist, and how to fight back against the plantation machine. So these are not just innocent stories of a cunning, naughty, cheeky spider. They are stories of how to survive, and that's why those stories continue. Given the survivalist nature of these stories, they are often concerned with food. They often start with famine, with shortage. Often Anansi is hungry, his family is hungry. And in West African versions and in the Caribbean, this is the case. So Anansi is a trickster. He's a strategist. He doesn't have very much materially, especially not money. But what he has is cunning, wit, and he has 7 friends, tiger, alligator, snake. They uses when he wants, but betrays when he wants to too. It's all about Anansi and feeding Anansi, and Anansi will fill his stomach even before his own family members. So many of these stories are about starting with food shortage and acquiring food, and sometimes eating while others starve. And a number of them have been translated, particularly in the 20th century, by people such as Philip Sherlock. But these are all narratives first and foremost. So a couple of Anansi stories, just before I go to that, as if to prove my point that Anansi is alive and well. Here he is on some US postage stamps from a couple of years back, and back here is Neil Gaiman's, what's it called, the American God series, which has a character, Anansi. It's the same Anansi, that trickster god. So, a couple of stories. My favourite Anansi story, I'm not going to tell it all, but I'll keep it quite short, here's some illustrations of Anansi, is Anansi and the crabs. Anansi goes down to the seafront, dressed as a preacher, and he preaches to the crabs. And the crabs are so impressed by his preaching style and his beautiful voice that they agree to come back to his kitchen to be baptised. They come back to his kitchen and his wife has put on the boiling salted water, and in they go one by one. They're baptised and then Anansi eats them all. That's Anansi and the crabs. On how the spider got a bald head, this is from a 1930 collection of African folk tales, including Anansi. Anansi gets his comeuppance for eating at a funeral when he's pretending to be fasting in honour of the dead. So he's in trouble because he's supposed to be fasting, eating again, but he has been eating. So he goes to a ceremony and he's about to be caught eating hot beans. Because he doesn't want to be discovered eating the hot beans, he quickly hides them in his hat. But then when he puts his hat on, it burns his hair off, and that's why the spider has no hair on top of his head. So there are often stories about eating, but not just eating. Food in these stories is literally and literarily a matter of life and death. So that's Brer Anansi, Anansi and the plantains here. Here's his friend Tiger, Dog, Goat, and they're all put in service to little Anansi here. And usually ends with Anansi getting the king's share of the food. Just going to move on just quickly to another illustration. And here he is with his family. And he's tricked even his family into giving half of that plantain to him. So they all break their plantains into half and give him a half when everyone's had a half, but Anansi's had everybody else's half as well. So I want to suggest that those little stories that are often seen innocently as children's stories, or as just folklore, link into a way of life, a Caribbean philosophy. Anansi may be selfish, but he's alive. Anansi resists with his use of ingenuity, cunning and guile, and he uses that to survive the brutal plantation regime. Out of necessity then, slaves on the plantations cooked for themselves over open fires. They had very limited utensils. The clay pot or the Dutch pot, which I started with, were central. And like Anansi, they adapted whatever food was available. They were given basic rations, often salt fish and disgusting kind of rice provisions. But more importantly, all enslaved people in the British Caribbean were given provision grounds. What they meant was kind of scrubby bits of land that the colonial overseers didn't want, that they couldn't cultivate, and slaves were allowed to grow their own ground provisions there, so starchy things like yam, and they grow callaloo and spinach and so on. Because they only had the most basic utensils, they learned to cook often in one-pot meals. And so the one-pot meal is not unique to the Caribbean. It's found in all peasant cultures. It's found in Italy, it's found in lots of other places in the south of France. But it took on a greater importance, I think, because it was predicated on survival. In life, as in your cooking, ingenuity, resourcefulness, adaptation, using local conditions and ingredients was absolutely key to survival. And even, you know, in the last 3 or 4 years when I've been back in the Caribbean, I've seen people enacting this still. For example, in Barbados, there's a tradition to go and bathe in the sea early in the morning, which is a beautiful thing to do if you're retired, and you've got time to do that, because it's also when the racehorses go and have their exercise. But part of that community is bringing what you have from your garden. So after you swim, retired people open up their boots and they're like, I've got loads of green banana, I've got lots of this, I've got lots of that. Sharing with the community goes back to those Nancy tactics. And there are loads and loads of examples of making do in Caribbean life. What does making do mean? It means using what you have. And I might argue that it's not just a kind of thriftiness, it's also a practice of liberation and empowerment. On the cover of my book, you'll see these West Indian ladies at the end of the 19th century walking to market, and they're known as higglers. They're in Jamaica, they're walking to Kingston, and on their heads, in their baskets, is their produce. And higglers emerged out of the provision grounds. Enslaved people were allowed to grow their own food, which in many cases kept them alive. But women in particular capitalised on this to start their own businesses, to take these to market, to make money, to buy other things. And it was almost exclusively women, known as the higglers, that did this in the Caribbean. So making do might be something that actually is not just necessity, but actually quite subversive, because these women are working for themselves, they're not working for the man. They're feeding their families, they're providing for them. And I mean, this is a classic example of the one-pot meal from the Caribbean, and it's also very Guyanese, so hopefully Ros will be pleased that I talked about this. It's known as pepper pot, and pepper pot comes in different forms. It can sometimes be like a soup, sometimes like a chunkier stew, and it uses cassowary, which comes from the cassava, and which the original Amerindians used to preserve raw meat. But in this case, it's being cooked in a pot. And I wanted to share with you a very early response to pepper pot. Way back in the 1700s, or 1600s, at the end of the 17th century, understandably there were many white European travellers, medics, colonists visiting the British Caribbean. And in this account, which is in part a send-up, a kind of satirical account, this particular writer called Edward Ward talks about his experiences of Caribbean food, and in particular, pepper pot. The chiefest of their provisions is sea turtle, or toad in a shell, stewed in its own gravy. Its lean is as white as a green sickness girl. It's fat of a calf's turd colour, you read that right, and is exceedingly good to put a stranger into a flux and purge out part of those ill humours it infallibly creates. So he said the food looks sick and it will make you sick, and not in a good way, not in a 20-something-year-old sick. They have beef without fat, lean mutton without gravy, and fowls as dry as the udder of an old woman and as tough as a steak from the haunches of a superannuated cart horse. So he is in part sending this up, but he's also very characteristic of European accounts of Caribbean food. They make a rare soup. Here's pepper pot. They make a rare soup they call pepper pot. It's an excellent breakfast for a salamander, or a good preventative for a mountebank's agent who eats fire one day that he may get better victuals the next. 3 spoonfuls so inflamed my mouth that I devoured a peck of horseradish and drank after a gallon of brandy and gunpowder and divers likes, similar things, etc., etc. I could not have been more importunate for a drop of water to cool my tongue. So he tries pepper pot and he says, it's really hot, it's really, really hot, it's off the scale hot, and it's horrendous. And I had to go and drink lots of alcohol to get over it, which is also satirising the white planter class in the Caribbean, the ways in which they socialised and met largely through extravagant dinner parties, at which there would be many, many courses and lots of alcohol. When we think about that kind of indulgence and extravagance, it is obscene when we think about the food poverty of the enslaved people living within the same places. And here, the final, I'll leave you with this. He goes on, they have oranges, lemons, limes, and several other fruits as sharp and crabbed as themselves, not given them as a blessing but a curses for eating so many sour things. For eating so many sour things, it generates a corroding slime in the bowels, and is one great occasion of that fatal and intolerable distemper, the dry bellyache, which in a fortnight or 3 weeks takes away the use of their limbs, and they are forced to be led about by negroes. So the other thing he says, their citrus fruits aren't like they are in Europe. They're terrible, they're sour, and they cause all kinds of bowel problems. And that's clearly a satire. It's a satire on the kinds of things that white travellers and interlopers were saying about Caribbean food. But if, and what he's doing is he's separating himself out from the white planter class. He's saying, without exception, Caribbean food and dishes are inferior to the European. They're too tough, they're too oily, too hot, too sour, too much for the moderate and refined European palate. But if we read that against the grain, we think about that otherwise, Ward's account also reveals the emergence of a different story, a story of a nation or a region being told through its food, how identity is being formed in part based on what people eat, and what people were eating was increasingly creolised. So African foods, European foods are coming together, being creolised, and we have the beginnings of Caribbean cuisine. So that's pepper pot, and it really was cooked, and it's the best known version of the one pot meal still eaten throughout the Caribbean. It's using local ingredients, largely indigenous ingredients. For much of this period, pepper pot was marked as slave food, but quite when and why pepper pot was first served to the planter class and appropriated as part of their cuisine is uncertain, but we do know that it did. It crossed the divide via the conduit of black cooks that would be doing the cooking in the great houses. And interestingly, I'm coming to an end now, in 1965, in a 1965 cookbook from the Caribbean, the author notes the longevity of the dish, meaning not just, it's still being eaten, but some people had kept their pots going for a long time. I'm not sure whether I believe this, but apparently pepper pot can be kept going for several months and is also almost passed on from generation to generation. I'm not sure I'd be pleased if my mum passed on something that had been going for like 40 years. Every evening it is warmed up and fresh meat and cold remains are added to it. So the idea of casserole is that you can do that for a certain period of time as long as you boil up. So if you eat in the Caribbean, make sure it's been boiled first and you'll be absolutely fine. And Sir Algernon Aspinall, what a fantastic name, declared in the pocket guidebook to the West Indies in 1920 that he had eaten a pepper pot which was said to be 100 years old. I'm not sure I really believe that. So pepper pot is a kind of iconic Caribbean one-pot meal. It comes out of the cooking of the enslaved. It comes out of what's locally available. It has a particular function within domestic economy. It's an efficient way of eking out food. You add to it, you boil it up. There's not much meat or saltfish, there are lots of vegetables that you've grown in your provision grounds. And of course, that idea of making do is a Caribbean philosophy that comes out of necessity, not out of choice. I'm just going to finish with this wonderful collection which was published in 2014 called Pepper Pot, which were news stories from the Caribbean. And there's a short story in this by a writer called Ivory Kelly, and it's a story called This Thing We Call Love. And the young female protagonist in this story says of Pepper Pot, "My mother and her friends' conversations were like boiler, like Pepper Pot, with plantains and cassava and other kinds of ground fruit," she means the starchy vegetables, salted meat, all thrown into a pot of water in no particular order, and boiled until it's a steaming, bubbling, savoury cuisine. So she says, my mother and my friends' conversations, storytelling, talking, eating, cooking. And that link between storytelling and foodways, I think, is particularly pronounced in a Caribbean context. And orality is alive and well. Obviously, people in the Caribbean are literate, they can rhyme. But there's also a really lively oral culture of call and response, of talking, of banter, of what they call in Trinidad piquant, being really witty and funny, and being really, really adept verbally. As John Lyons, a writer and artist from Trinidad, has said, we like our piquant, we like our piquancy in both our food and our talk. I'm just going to end here with some proverbs, which I don't think I should read, but I'm going to... No, that was the quotation from... There's Pepper Pot. And let's go to the end. Oh, this is going to be the death of me. There. I'm just going to end the two, I don't want to read them actually, because it would be fake in my accent, the two Caribbean proverb poems. The second one in particular is about what I've been talking about, which is about food and plenty, food and famine. It's by James Berry, who was born in Jamaica and lived and worked in the UK for many years. And it's a Caribbean proverb poem. And part of oral tradition is this kind of wisdom that's been passed on orally, not in written version. And it reads, hungry belly and full belly don't walk the same path. They don't walk the same paths. Full belly always to tell empty belly. Keep heart. Hunger, famine, plenty, food poverty. Still to the fore. These are older proverbs that have been adapted, and I think I'm going to end there after all my tech mishaps. So sorry about the rather dislocated version of that. But hopefully that's given you an idea. So Dutchy travels not just with food, but with stories. The oral culture is alive and well, and Nancy stories are everywhere. And if you hear about them again, tell people they're not just for children, and they're not just folklore stories. And what I didn't know as a child when I read the Brer Rabbit stories was that the Brer Rabbit stories are, of course, the African-American version of the Nancy stories. Brer Rabbit and his friends are outwitting the foes that are coded versions of the plantation owners, of the overseers. So he is, again, as a child I just thought this is about an naughty rabbit. It's absolutely not. And we know that these are the stories that survive, the stories that tell us something, that mean something. So I hope that that's been interesting. Sorry about all the